Hello everyone and welcome back to another book review. Today I am going to be reviewing The Middle Ages, A Graphic History, and this is by Eleanor Janega and Neil Max Emanuel. I'm not entirely sure how to pronounce her last name, so I will put it in the description, but this is exactly as advertised, a graphic novel almost style or a graphic visual history to the Middle Ages in a book that's a little under 200 pages. It has quite a colorful cover, and in this book review I'm going to be discussing the format and the layout as well as what's contained within this book, and then I'm going to talk about some things that I really liked in this book and what I thought this book was appropriate for, and the parts of the book that I was just feeling a little on. So I'm going to be doing all of that in this book review. Let's dive in and discuss The Middle Ages, A Graphic History. So I think the first thing I want to discuss is the appropriate book for the appropriate occasion sort of commentary. Because when we think of something like the Middle Ages, that is a massive history of time. Using some rounded dates that I'm sure the author will hate me for saying, the Middle Ages runs about, or in my head, from 500 AD to 1500 AD and is more of a European phenomenon, although there were other things going on in other parts of the world at this time that's important as well. So that is a massive, massive stretch of history, 1,000 years crossing many different governments, forms of governments, rulers, different institutions, including things like the Catholic Church. It may include things like the beginning and going into the Reformation. There's a wide change in art and architecture throughout this time, and there's a lot going on in 1,000 years. So you may think, how can you condense all of that into 200 pages and have it as a little lighthearted graphic guide? And I think that's where the conversation on the appropriate book for the appropriate time comes in. I saw this book in my library catalog and I was intrigued to check it out because I've been getting into medieval art lately and reading a lot of books about that, and I wanted to kind of have a refresher on medieval history. I have taken many history courses throughout my life and I've done a lot of reading, and so a lot of the stuff that was contained within this book was not new information, but I kind of wanted a refresher laid out for me, kind of hitting the highlights, maybe like a highlight tour sort of the big events, the big key players, and the order in which it happened in the Middle Ages to give a refresher. There's a time and a place for a book like this. I think another good suitable example of a book like this would be a teen who's interested in history but isn't ready for a huge massive book, or someone who isn't into history at all but maybe wants to learn a little bit more about the topic presented in a fun and lighthearted manner. Because the book does take an informal conversational tone throughout the book, it isn't trying to be a serious heavy hitter. And don't get me wrong, as someone who personally loves reading about history, there is a time and a place for a book that discusses a niche topic in the Middle Ages and goes on for 600, 700, 800, even 1,000 pages. There is a time and a place for books like that, but there's also time and a place and room, I think, in our libraries for books like this, which just provide the basic information in a lighthearted and fun manner to introduce readers to topics, and then based on what they read in this book, they can choose one of those niche topics or choose to go into further exploration in some of those longer books. So yes, this is definitely just the highlights. We're getting just the high level view of the Middle Ages, and the authors really had to trim down what they're going to discuss and cover in this book, as we'll see in my likes and dislikes section. So I understand that this is going to be pared down, and for those of you who really love history and don't want to see any simplifications, there's going to be things in this book that you think, oh, that was kind of a simplification, or maybe you should support that more. But there is a place for a book like this, and for my purposes, just getting a brief overview, this was a fun introduction. The style, as mentioned, is quite lighthearted. The format of this book is each page has a topic. So we start at the beginning. What is the medieval period? And you get 1 or 2 pages where there's text, but there's also little drawings. And I believe the Neil Max Emanuel from the front page is the one who did all of the illustrations. So the this Eleanor woman, I say woman, she's a historian. The historian Eleanor Janega did the text, is my understanding. And then we have the illustrations throughout. So you just have one topic, which is mentioned here, and it's covered. So if we just flip through to see what else we can have. There's parts too. So part 3, the rise of empire and kingship, starting with Charlemagne. He gets his page. He gets a continuation page. Then we go into Pope Leo. Then we go into the Thalassocratic city-states. So as we can see, each topic is really only getting a page or two at most. You get 2 pages if you're really special like Charlemagne. So we're really just hitting topics in chronological order that occurred or took place in the Middle Ages. This could be people, events, states, why something is the way it was. And there were slight inner inclusions of text throughout, not text as what the historian wrote, but she'll quote things throughout in little sections as well. Sometimes it's included in the drawing to get kind of that primary source feel, but it always stays kind of lighthearted, conversational, just introducing in a couple paragraphs some drawings which veer more towards the humorous, as we can see here, as opposed to the serious, but definitely cover a wide variety of topics, including more serious topics as well. So now let's talk about the bits of this book that I liked. I think this is a great overview for people who, like me, need a refresher or want a refresher on medieval history, people who are not history oriented but feel like this is an area that they want to fill their gaps in, people who maybe want to get into history and are not sure what topics in the Middle Ages interest them. That's a big problem. As mentioned, it's 1,000 years of human history, and human history in just one section of the globe, I should add. And it can be intimidating when you're faced with wall after wall of recommendation or books online that are 600, 700 pages on just a niche topic and you're not even sure where to start. I think this is a fantastic introduction to the topic, and it keeps things surface level enough where you never feel like you're getting bogged down in a topic that you maybe are not interested in, but you feel like you have enough information to continue to move forward. I do like the lighthearted tone. I think there's a time and a place for a more serious tone, and I don't think the author ever becomes like inappropriately lighthearted when there's an actual serious topic to discuss, but the author does keep a lighthearted and casual tone throughout the entire book, so you never feel like you're really getting dragged down into some details and getting in the weeds of things too much. Things kind of stay humorous throughout the entire book, and that matches with the graphic guide style that the author is going for. I liked and I appreciated the fact that the beginning dates and the end dates were murky, and she makes very clear that the beginning of the Middle Ages and the end of the Middle Ages are murky, and they would have been murky. I think this is something that maybe people don't know much, or maybe don't know is selling people short. They may not understand, or when did the Middle Ages start and when did the Middle Ages end? What I'm trying to say here is no one in 500 AD or 476 or whenever you want to put the beginning of the Middle Ages woke up, no one stretched, opened their window with their cup of coffee and said, oh, we've moved from the ancient time to the Middle Ages today. That didn't happen. There was no one defining moment where people started thinking of themselves as moving from ancient to modern. Of course, it would have all been contemporary to them, but there also wasn't like this one defining moment where things just switched. And that can come across as maybe a little confusing to people who aren't familiar with the topic. I think the beginning of Middle Ages, most people would say that would be the fall of Rome, which was 476, but the author shows very clearly, I think it was 476. Am I just making a fool of myself by misremembering the date? Yeah, 476. When it fell, it wasn't even like things changed in the day-to-day level in Rome immediately that very same day. So she makes a point that even though we feel like we have this date that I'm rounding up to 500, it didn't change immediately overnight for people, even though that is kind of used as the beginning point. The end point too is also very murky, and I'm going to use this point to move into some of my things I dislike. But the end point, when did the Middle Ages end? And most people say, well, the Renaissance, and that's what we'll talk about in the dislike section. But there was also the Reformation at that time, and we have to ask ourselves, which Reformation? I think most people, when we say the Reformation, we think of the one that was kind of kicked off by Martin Luther. And I wouldn't say they were reformations, but they were religious movements before then where the power of the Catholic Church was challenged. And the author kind of brings in something that I think she did a really good job in doing, and showing that different people disagreed with when the Middle Ages ended. So when did the Middle Ages end? So here's some of the ones she goes through. The Hussites, which is the time that, in her argument, and I think this is the viewpoint that she takes, is the time when the supremacy of the Catholic Church in Western Europe was kind of broken for the first time. Although I think many other people may argue that Luther had an impact as well. I mean, he did. That's not really an argument. We also have fall of Constantinople, which was kind of seen as the continuation of the Roman Empire in the East. So was that the end of the Middle Ages? Or maybe the completion of the Reconquista, the Iberian Peninsula being taken back over from Muslim control. Was that the moment that it ended? Which of these dates kind of marks the end? Because again, no one woke up one day in 1500 AD, opened their window, had their cup of coffee, and said, the Middle Ages are done. There was no concept of that. These are kind of ideas that modern people looking back are using to group time periods together. And there is a purpose in that because there are similarities within these different time periods, and we can talk about this. But picking an exact date, an exact day in which everything changed forever permanently is hard to identify. And there are some important dates, like was it like October 30, 1517? I'm embarrassing myself with my date knowledge here. When Martin Luther nailed his 95 things on the church door, like that is a date that we can say, well, something happened that day and things really weren't the same. But saying that someone woke up that day 3 countries over and life was different forever was not true. Things kind of change gradually, and it's only in a retrospective view can we see, okay, there was some sort of ending at this time of the church's supremacy of power. And now we've kind of moved into a different era. So I like that she kind of explores those ideas at the beginning and end, but in a way that's still lighthearted, and also you don't feel like you're bogged down in the details. I also really like the way she structured her further reading section. She starts with general reading, and then she goes into the early, middle, and late Middle Ages, because there are like 3 sections within the Middle Ages, kind of this early, this high, and then this late period, which are also kind of distinct. I shouldn't say kind of, they are distinct. And then we have the additional readings down here for the Middle Ages. So I like the way she structured further reading, and I took some books from here that seemed interesting and added them to my to-read list, which I shouldn't have done. I'm trying to get the to-read list shorter, and it's becoming longer, which is the opposite of what I want to do. But whatever, it'll get read eventually, and it's all interesting, so what can I say? Now I'm going to go into the parts that I was a little about. Overall, I think this is like a 4-star read. This is fantastic, and nothing I say in the dislike section would dissuade me from recommending it or reading it or liking it, and it didn't ruin my enjoyment of the book. There were just some things that I nitpicked, and I want to continue to improve my ability to read books more critically and find things, when there's bits that I don't like, I want to think about why I don't like them. So this is what I'm doing in this section. It's still a fantastic book, and I still do recommend you reading it, and I don't think anything would cause me to discourage someone from reading this. The first is what gets picked and what doesn't. Obviously, this is a hard decision when you have a 200-page book, what topics get covered and what doesn't. But sometimes I feel like there were topics that were put in and got way more screen time than a 200-page book on the Middle Ages would maybe lead you to think. And I know why this happens. This is due to, this is my opinion. Preface this with my opinion. If I'm wrong, you can call me out in the comments. My understanding is that you don't just go get a PhD in history or whatever, however Eleanor, the historian, has studied. She didn't just study all human history, because that's too broad. You specialize, and you specialize into very, very, very niche things. And I looked up this author online, and I found it here. It says she is a medieval historian specializing in sexuality, apocalypticism, propaganda, and the urban experience in the medieval period generally, and in late medieval Bohemia in particular. So she has studied one very, very niche, or a couple different niche topics within the Middle Ages, and her focus on that is going to lead her to select certain things to be included in this book that someone else who studied Middle Ages, but maybe with different concentrations and speciality, would pick different things to include. And I think that's where, whenever you say, why is this getting so much screen time? It's the author's focus that she studied that is leading to that level of specialization and is leading to that topic getting so much screen time in this book. So I do understand why that gets picked, but there were some things that I was like, this seems like a more niche topic in the sense that it wouldn't fit, in my opinion, in the 200-page overview, or maybe it shouldn't have as much screen time. But of course, the author's working within her own knowledge, and that's going to lead to her own opinions and her own decision making on what should be picked and what should make the cut and what shouldn't. I also feel like every historian, because I went to college and I really liked history. I was a math major, but I took a lot of history courses just for fun. every historian whose books I've read, whatever their specialization, they think that specialization is the reason for everything. They can link it to everything, which makes sense. You spend so much time studying something, you can see all the other things that it touches, when probably it's a mixture of many different things touching each other that's kind of creating changes in history. But I think it's understandable how a historian starts getting the focus on the particular topics that they do. And one of the endpoints that the author proposes for the end of the Middle Ages is it Jan Hus? Am I saying his name correctly? The Hussites in the Bohemian region, let me make sure it's the actual Bohemian region. Czech. Who was, I think that section was influenced. Let me just back up and say this. I think that section was influenced by the author's opinion on the end of the Middle Ages. I have heard of Jan Hus and I've heard of his influence, and I do think that there was a point in maybe which the Catholic Church showed they weren't as powerful as they could have been. But what I'm trying to say here is I feel like her selection at that date was influenced by her specialization. That's all I'm going to say. We're going to leave it at that. Next up is the Renaissance, and this was a section that I feel like the author maybe the 200-page brief introduction to the Middle Ages, maybe the author should have reconsidered something, but I'm assuming this is a strong opinion that she holds, and therefore she wanted to include it. The Renaissance period. The author kind of dismisses the Renaissance as, we can't talk about the Renaissance because the Renaissance is just Italian and it doesn't encompass anything that's going on, and therefore it's not a good end date of the Middle Ages. But if you ask most people what follows the Middle Ages, most people I think are either going to say the Reformation or the Renaissance. One of the things that she points out, and I think maybe I'm misreading this, but I feel like is a little incorrect, and I wish I had tabbed this page. But one of the things she mentioned is, well, we don't talk about any of the other people who are important that aren't part of the Renaissance. And she called out Van Eyck, Bosch, am I saying that last name correctly, and Dürer as three artists who would be overlooked. But every time I've studied the Renaissance in any sort of school setting, including a one-year-long course in the humanities, those three were definitely included in our Renaissance period. And I understand that Italy was the birthplace of the Renaissance, but she kind of dismissed the Renaissance as an unimportant and not useful definition for something that came after the Middle Ages. And I want to say I am open to that idea. I'm open to hearing someone's arguments for why that wasn't a good endpoint, why the ending of the Catholic Church supremacy in Western Europe was a more important endpoint. So I don't want to come on here saying, she's wrong and this isn't important. But I think that if you're going to introduce a topic like that, that isn't well known in the public, I would say, and also needs a little bit more backing and is also very, very interesting, I think maybe a 200-page overview of the Middle Ages isn't the place for it. I am definitely open to that opinion. She's clearly more intelligent than me, so I'm sure she knows what she's talking about. She has some strong arguments for this, but I felt like introducing that topic in a book like this was not helpful, and it may be a place where she could just mention that there was a Renaissance that started in Italy, and in the further reading section, she could refer people, or she could reference, like, not everyone believes that this is a good term to encompass all Western Europe. Move along and then let people do additional reading, because a topic like that and a statement like that, in my opinion, requires a lot more backing, to the point where I would want to read, that's a book that I want covered, a topic that I want covered in a 300, 400, 500 page book. That's what I want covered in that book. That was a lot to introduce, I feel like, in 2 pages, and I'm not sure how I feel about it. I'm open to the idea, but I definitely want more information than what this book gave me on that Renaissance section. Overall, I think this is a fantastic book. I think it's a great overview for the Middle Ages. I think that the topics covered were very interesting. I felt like it was lighthearted without veering towards the disrespectful, and it was very, very fun. So if you're looking for an overview of the Middle Ages, even if you feel like you know a lot about it, this could be a fun, interesting book. Maybe if you have a kid in your life who's interested in the Middle Ages and you want to get them a gift, not sure where to start, they're not ready for those 1,000-page tomes on English history, this could be a very, very good starting place. It is relatively appropriate, I would say, for a teen on up, and it covers a lot of the major points of medieval history, giving anyone who reads it a good springboard into further reading from this book. So I think it's a fantastic option. I think there were some points that I was a little contentious on, but that's going to be any book. The author and the illustrator did a fantastic job putting this book together. I had a great time reading it. I learned a lot. I feel like I have a lot of good directions I want my future reading to go in, and overall, I'm glad that I read this book, and I would love to hear from you. If you've read this book, if you have any recommendations, if you think I'm totally off base, on anything that I've said in this video, please put it down below. Again, I've never studied history formally, so there could be some inaccuracies. I love to hear from you, love to hear what you're reading, love to hear what you thought about this book, love to hear what you think about my rant about the Renaissance. Put it all in the comment section down below. I love to receive comments. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.